When Robert died, I thought the hardest part of my life was over. I buried the man I loved for 40 years and held on to the only thing he left me. $46,000 in insurance, not just money, but a piece of him I promised never to touch, unless I had to. I thought family would protect that memory. But nothing prepared me for the moment I walked into the bank and saw my own son, the boy I once rocked to sleep trying to take every last dollar for himself. People talk about strangers breaking your trust. They never tell you the deepest cuts come from the ones who share your blood. I still remember the weight of that morning in March, the quiet Boston air pressing against the windows of my small house. I was 62, a retired elementary school teacher who had spent decades corralling children, tying shoelaces, wiping tears, and grading endless spelling tests. Now the house was silent. Too silent. And every creak of the floor reminded me that Robert was gone. Robert had been my husband for nearly 40 years. A tall, broad-shouldered man who worked as a civil engineer, always carrying blueprints under his arm and a pencil tucked behind his ear. He died in 2018 suddenly from a heart attack while on a job site. One moment we were talking about repainting the kitchen, and the next I was standing in a hospital room staring at a still chest and a line that no longer moved on the monitor. The grief had a sharpness to it then that has dulled into something heavier, slower, like a stone I keep in my pocket. When he passed, the insurance company sent me a check for $46,000. I remember holding it in my hands, the paper crisp, and smelling faintly of ink. To most people it was just money, but to me it was Robert's last gift, the last tangible thing he left me. I never spent a cent. I placed it in a dedicated account, one I swore I would never touch. It was not just about security. It was about memory, respect, something sacred between us. My life since then has been simple, almost too quiet. I walk to the market, I tend to the roses in the backyard, I volunteer at the library twice a week. People say retirement is freedom, but when your partner is gone, that freedom can feel like exile. I often sit at the dining table where Robert and I used to drink coffee together. Sometimes I catch myself speaking out loud to the empty chair. "You would have loved how the roses bloomed this year," I whisper, as if he's just stepped out of the room. And then there are the boys. Daniel, my oldest, is 35 now. From the day he was born, I spoiled him in ways I never admitted to anyone, not even Robert. He had his father's dark hair and my green eyes, and I carried him through every failure as if it were my own. I gave him extra money when he said he needed help starting a small business. I defended him when Robert insisted he needed to stand on his own. "He'll find his way," I used to say. But deep down I worried that I had only taught him how to lean on me harder. Stephen, my younger son, is 29. He teaches high school English not far from here. Practical, steady, careful with his words. He never asked for much, never complained when I gave more to Daniel. Sometimes I think Stephen saw right through me, saw how unevenly I balanced my love, but he never said anything. He would just hug me, kiss my cheek, and remind me to take care of myself. Daniel, on the other hand, had always been restless. Jobs came and went. He tried sales, construction, even running a small cafe with a friend. Each ended in failure, and each time I reached into my savings to soften the blow. "It's just money," I told myself. "He's my son." But Robert would frown, his voice heavy. "Mo, you're not doing him any favors, Maggie. One day he has to stand up on his own." I would nod, but when Robert wasn't looking, I would slip Daniel another check. After Robert died, that dynamic only deepened. Daniel started stopping by more often, sitting at the kitchen table with that charming smile he knew melted me. Sometimes he'd ask about the house. Was I keeping up with the bills? Did I need help with maintenance? Other times he'd bring groceries, leave them on the counter, and then casually mention his car loan or a late utility payment. I knew what he was doing. I also knew that if I reached for my checkbook, I'd resent myself later. But the money from Robert, the $46,000, I kept separate. I never told Daniel exactly where it was or how I managed it. Still, I suspected he thought about it. There was a way his eyes flickered when the subject of money came up, a flicker I recognized because I had seen it when he was a boy wanting something he couldn't afford. I sometimes lay awake at night thinking about my choices. Had I raised Daniel to be dependent? Had I confused love with rescue? The questions ate at me in the dark when the house was still, and Robert's absence pressed the hardest. One Sunday afternoon, I found myself looking through old photo albums. Robert holding baby Daniel at the hospital. Stephen's kindergarten graduation where Daniel refused to wear a tie. Family vacations in Maine, Robert laughing in the background while the boys built sandcastles. The pictures were full of joy. But when I closed the book, I felt a hollowness. What had become of us? Where had the years gone? I walked to the bank that week just to ask for a printed balance of the account where I kept the insurance money. The teller handed it over and I tucked it into my purse without even glancing at it. I already knew the number 46,000 untouched. It gave me a strange sense of comfort knowing it sat there safe like Robert was still watching over me. Back home, I sat at the dining table and spread the papers out. Bills for utilities, modest pension checks, my small teacher's retirement savings, and then that one slip with the number that meant everything. I traced my finger over the line, whispering, "I've kept it safe, Robert. I promise." I had no idea then that the promise I made would soon be tested in ways I never imagined. For now, though, I folded the paper, slid it back into its envelope, and placed it in the top drawer of my desk. I closed the drawer softly, as if sealing away not just money, but my last thread of connection to the man I loved. And I sat there for a long time, listening to the quiet, letting the weight of both love and fear rest on my shoulders. The knock on the door that Tuesday afternoon was light, almost polite, but I knew it was Daniel before I even opened it. He never called first anymore. He stood there with Laura at his side, his smile practiced and bright, while her eyes darted anywhere but mine. I stepped back, letting them in, though my stomach tightened as they brushed past me into the kitchen. Daniel sat down at the table as if it belonged to him, tapping his fingers against the wood. "Mom, how are you holding up?" "Been eating okay?" he asked. Voice warm, almost too warm. Laura remained standing, her coat still buttoned, clutching her purse like a shield. "I'm fine," I said, taking the chair across from him. "Why don't you both sit down?" Laura murmured something about being comfortable where she was, and Daniel didn't push. Instead, he leaned forward, lowering his voice as if sharing a secret. "You know, Mom, I've been thinking. That insurance money Dad left you, you really shouldn't have to worry about managing it all alone. It's a lot of responsibility. I could step in, help make sure it grows, instead of just sitting there." I felt the words sink in slow and heavy. My fingers curled against my lap. "It's safe where it is," I answered carefully. "I'm not looking to grow it. It's not an investment. It's Robert's gift," he chuckled lightly, shaking his head. "But Mom, that's exactly the point. Dad wouldn't want you just letting it rot in a savings account. Inflation eats away at money like that. If you let me, I could put it into something smart. I've been reading about high-yield opportunities and—" "Daniel," I interrupted sharper than I meant. "It's fine where it is." The smile slipped for just a second before he replaced it. "I only want to help. You've always trusted me. Why not now?" I caught Laura's expression then. Her lips pressed tight, her eyes fixed on the floor. She looked like she wanted to vanish. I realized she hadn't said a single word since they walked in. Maybe another time, I said, rising to refill my coffee, though my hands trembled as I lifted the pot. "It's not something I'm changing." Daniel sighed, leaning back, but the tapping of his fingers on the table returned faster this time. "I don't want you to get taken advantage of. Scams are everywhere, Mom. Don't you read the news? Someone like you alone with money. It's a target." I turned to face him. "I'm not worried about scams." For a heartbeat, our eyes met, and I knew he heard what I wasn't saying. The silence stretched until Laura finally whispered, "Daniel, maybe we should go." He shot her a quick look, tight with irritation, but stood anyway. "We'll talk about this later, Mom," he said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. His lips were warm, but his eyes were cold. Then he was gone. Laura trailing quietly behind him, her purse clutched just as tightly as when she arrived. The door closed and I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. The house seemed darker without them, the corners sharper. I sat back down at the table, staring at the wood grain where Robert once laid his morning newspaper. For the first time, the silence of the house didn't feel like grief. It felt like warning. That evening, the phone rang, pulling me out of my thoughts. Stephen's voice came through steady and comforting. "Hey, Mom. Just checking in. How was your day?" I hesitated, considering what to say. "Daniel came by," I admitted. "He wanted to talk about your father's insurance money." Stephen's sigh was long, heavy with something more than surprise. "Mom, you can't let him get near that account. He's not thinking straight these days." I told him no. I said, though, my voice wavered. "Good. He'll push again. You know him. Just be careful. Don't let him sweet-talk you. He's desperate." The word desperate hung in the air after we hung up. I walked through the house, turning off lights, checking locks, though it was habit more than necessity. Still, when I passed the desk in the corner, my gaze lingered on the drawer where the bank papers rested. I touched the handle lightly but didn't open it. Instead, I whispered, "I won't let him, Robert. I promise." Yet for the first time, I felt the fragile edge of that promise. That night as I lay in bed, I replayed Daniel's smile, his insistence the way Laura couldn't meet my eyes. A quiet dread settled over me. For years I had defended him, told myself he just needed time, that he'd turn things around. But as I stared at the ceiling in the dark, I began to wonder if I had been blind all along. The house was silent again, but this time it wasn't grief pressing against me. It was suspicion. And suspicion has a way of keeping you wide awake. The next Saturday, I drove across town to the small apartment where Daniel and Laura lived. I told myself it was just a casual visit, a mother checking in, but the truth was I wanted to see with my own eyes what his life looked like now. The building was old brick, 3 stories with narrow stairwells that smelled faintly of fried onions and stale beer. When I climbed the steps to their unit, I noticed a stack of unopened envelopes shoved against the door. Bright red stamps marked some of them past due. Laura opened the door, startled, her hair pulled back hastily. "Oh, hi, Margaret," she said softly, forcing a smile. "We weren't expecting you." "I was in the neighborhood," I replied, stepping inside before she could protest. The place was dim, curtains drawn though it was midday. Piles of laundry were heaped on the couch, dishes crusted in the sink. Daniel wasn't there. I glanced at the table where more envelopes sat, some slid open, some still sealed. One lay face up, a demand letter from a credit card company. The numbers glared at me. Thousands owed interest climbing. Laura followed my gaze and quickly shuffled the papers into a pile, her cheeks coloring. "He's been meaning to call them back," she murmured. A buzzing sound came from the counter. I turned my head to see their answering machine blinking red. Without hesitation, Laura pressed the button to stop it, but not before a mechanical voice announced, "This is a final attempt to reach Daniel Fisher regarding your outstanding balance." She cut it off, her hands trembling. I pretended not to notice her embarrassment, but inside my chest, my heart sank. "Where is he?" I asked quietly. "Out looking for work," she said, though her eyes betrayed her. She was lying. Daniel was many things, but diligent in a job search wasn't one of them. I walked slowly through the cramped space, noting the sagging bookshelf, the sticky floor near the fridge, the exhaustion etched in every corner. It wasn't poverty alone that unsettled me. It was neglect, the sense that Daniel was drowning and pulling Laura down with him. She tried to straighten a pile of magazines, her hands moving quickly as if tidiness could mask the truth. "We've just been a little overwhelmed," she said. I placed my hand on the back of a chair, steadying myself. "Laura," I said gently, "is everything all right?" She froze. eyes wide, then shook her head. "It's fine, really. Daniel he's under pressure. But he'll figure it out." Her voice cracked on the last word. I remembered a time years ago when Daniel begged me for money to invest in a coffee shop he swore would change his life. I co-signed the loan, even lent him part of my savings. Within a year, the shop closed, bills piled up, and Robert's jaw tightened with every envelope that arrived. I was the one who wrote the checks to cover the shortfall. I told myself then it was just a stumble that he'd learn. But looking around that apartment, the past sat in front of me, repeated like a worn-out song. I sat down heavily at their kitchen table. "Laura, you know I love him. He's my son. But I need to understand what's going on. Does he still owe money?" She pressed her lips together, then whispered, "More than he can handle." Tears filled her eyes, though she quickly blinked them back. "He doesn't want you to know." I reached across the table, touching her hand. "I already know more than he realizes." At that moment, the front door opened and Daniel stepped in, carrying a fast food bag. He stopped when he saw me, his smile faltering for half a second before he forced it back. "Mom." What a surprise. "Hello?" "Daniel," I said calmly. He dropped the bag on the counter, glanced at Laura, then back at me. "We were just talking about maybe visiting you tomorrow. What brings you here today?" "I wanted to see you," I replied, my voice steady. "And I did." His eyes flicked to the table where the letters had been, and I saw the flash of panic before he masked it with bravado. "You don't have to worry about us. Everything's under control." I didn't argue. I simply rose, smoothing my coat. "Take care of yourselves," I said, kissing Laura lightly on the cheek before walking to the door. On the drive home, the images haunted me. The envelopes, the blinking red light, Laura's downcast eyes. It was the same pattern I had lived through before, only worse. And this time, Daniel's gaze carried something sharper than desperation. It carried entitlement. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I knew the truth. My oldest son hadn't changed. When the walls closed in, he didn't build his own way out. He turned to me. He always turned to me. And deep down I feared that this time he wouldn't just be asking. He would be taking... The bank lobby was cool and smelled faintly of polished wood and carpet cleaner. I came in that morning with nothing more than the intention of getting a printed statement. I carried my small purse, the one Robert once teased me for, because it looked like it could barely hold a wallet. I moved toward the line of tellers, already rehearsing the polite words I'd say when I asked for the account balance. Then I saw him. Daniel stood at the counter near the far end, his shoulders tight, his posture rigid. His hand gripped the pen on its little chain, his jaw working as if he were chewing on a lie. My first instinct was surprise. What was he doing here on a weekday morning? He hadn't mentioned needing the bank. I slowed, staying partly behind a decorative column, just close enough to see without being seen. The young teller leaned over her face, politely neutral, as Daniel handed her his ID. "I'd like to withdraw the full amount," he said, his voice low but firm. My breath stopped. The teller turned the screen toward herself, and in that instant, I caught a glimpse of the numbers reflected in the glass behind the counter. 46,000. My heart hammered so loudly I was afraid it would echo in the lobby. Robert's money. The one account I had never touched. The teller hesitated. "Sir, this is a significant withdrawal. Are you certain?" Daniel's nod was quick, impatient. His fingers drummed on the counter, the same rhythm he used as a boy when waiting for me to hand him lunch money. I stepped forward, unable to hold back any longer. "Excuse me," I said, my voice sharper than I had intended. Daniel spun around. His face drained of color when he saw me. "Mom," the teller looked between us, startled. "What exactly are you doing?" I asked. My words steady, though my knees threatened to give way. He stammered. I was just helping you, Mom, making sure your account was safe." I moved closer. My eyes locked on his. "By taking everything out." The teller cleared her throat nervously. "Perhaps we should..." "Cancel that request," I said, firmly, turning to her. Do not process anything further. She nodded quickly, her fingers flying across the keyboard. Daniel reached for my arm. His voice dropping to a whisper meant only for me. Mom, please. You don't understand. I was going to move it into something better, something that could grow. You can't just leave it sitting there. I pulled my arm free. That money is not yours. People in the line behind us began to watch, their murmurs filling the room. Daniel's ears flushed red. I'm your son, he hissed. Dad would have wanted me to make sure you were taken care of. The words stung because of how easily he twisted Robert's memory, how casually he used his father's name as a shield. The teller handed back his ID. It's canceled, ma'am, she said to me quietly. I nodded, relief washing through me, though my stomach still churned. Daniel forced a smile, trying to recover. See, Mom? Just a misunderstanding. We'll talk about this later. He laughed lightly, but no one joined him. Even the teller's eyes were cool. I tucked my purse close to my chest. We will talk, I said, my voice steady. He stormed past me, pushing open the glass doors with more force than necessary, his figure disappearing into the sunlight outside. The silence he left behind was heavier than the murmur of the bank. I stood for a moment longer, my hands trembling, then thanked the teller and asked for the printed statement I had originally come for. She handed it to me with a sympathetic glance, as if she knew more than she could say. When I stepped outside, the Boston air felt sharper, colder. My son had tried to steal from me, from his father's memory, right under my nose. And though I had stopped him this time, I knew the battle was only beginning. I clutched the paper in my hand and walked slowly to my car, each step echoing with the weight of betrayal. I walked straight up to the counter, my heels clicking on the tile louder than I expected, but I didn't slow down. Daniel turned halfway toward me, his face tight, caught between panic and irritation. His hand hovered over the slip he'd signed, as if he could still shield it from me. This is the last of what your father left me, I said, my voice low but sharp enough to cut. The words came from somewhere deeper than anger, a place of mourning and defiance. Daniel blinked rapidly, then forced a laugh. Mom, come on. You make it sound like I was stealing. I was just trying to handle your finances so you wouldn't have to. It's complicated for someone your age. I cut him off with a glance that made the teller stiffen. Do not speak to me as if I'm a child. The teller's eyes flicked between us. Ma'am, do you want this withdrawal stopped? It hasn't been processed yet. I didn't hesitate. Yes. Stop it immediately. Daniel's shoulders jerked as if he'd been slapped. Mom, don't do this here. People are watching. They should watch, I said calmly, though my chest burned. Let them see what it looks like when a son tries to take from his own mother. A hush settled around us. Someone in line coughed uncomfortably. The teller tapped a few keys, handed me the statement, then slid Daniel's slip back toward him with a clipped tone. The transaction is canceled. Daniel shoved the paper aside, leaning close to me. You're making me look like a fool. You did that yourself, I whispered. For a second, the mask slipped. His face hardened, eyes flashing with a bitterness I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. He straightened, adjusted his jacket as though he could brush away the humiliation. We'll discuss this at home, he muttered. No, I said, still firm. We'll discuss nothing until you understand that money belongs to me. It is your father's final gift to his wife, not your lifeline. The teller cleared her throat again, trying to diffuse the tension. Is there anything else I can help you with today, ma'am? I forced a steadier breath. No, thank you. That's all. Daniel stormed toward the doors, his pace clipped and sharp. Heads turned as he left the glass swinging behind him with a crash. I remained at the counter a moment longer, collecting the paper with trembling fingers. Walking back across the lobby felt like crossing a battlefield. The silence that followed me was heavy with judgment, but I didn't care. I had drawn the line. Outside, the air hit me like a slap. Daniel was already by his car, jabbing at his phone, his face set in stone. I didn't approach him. I walked to my own car, unlocking it slowly, my hands steadier than I expected. As I sat down and folded the statement into my purse, I realized this was the first time I hadn't backed down, hadn't softened the truth with excuses. For years I had let him chip away at my patience, my savings, even my pride. But not this time. I glanced once more at him across the lot, my son pacing with anger, waving his free hand as he barked into the phone. He looked smaller somehow, caught in his own storm. I turned the key in the ignition, the hum of the engine grounding me. Then I pulled away, leaving him standing there, the figure of a man who had tried to cross a line I would never allow. And for the first time in years, I felt the faintest edge of control settle back into my hands. By late afternoon, I was back in my kitchen, rinsing vegetables for dinner, when the sound of a car door slamming made me glance out the window. Daniel and Laura were walking up the path together. He was striding fast, jaw tight, Laura half a step behind her, hands clasped as if bracing herself. Before I could even open the door fully, Daniel pushed past me into the living room. "Do you have any idea what you did to me today?" His voice cracked with fury. "You humiliated me in front of strangers, in front of an entire bank." Laura lingered by the doorway, her eyes darting between us. I saw her shoulders rise and fall quickly as if she couldn't quite breathe. I set the towel down on the counter and faced him. "I protected what your father left me." He laughed bitterly, pacing across the rug. Protected? You made me look like some kind of thief. People were staring. Do you know how that felt?" "Yes," I said evenly. "Like being caught?" His mouth opened, then snapped shut. He turned on Laura. "Are you hearing this?" "She's calling her own son a criminal," Laura murmured. "Daniel, maybe we should—" But he cut her off with a raised hand. Just then the front door opened again. Stephen's voice carried down the hall. "Mom, I thought I'd drop off those books you wanted." He walked into the room, stopped short at the sight of Daniel and the tension that clung to the air. His eyes flicked from my face to his brother's flushed cheeks. "What's going on?" Stephen asked slowly. Daniel threw his arms wide. "What's going on?" "Our dear mother thinks I'm trying to rob her. She embarrassed me publicly. She treats me like a beggar." I held his gaze. "You tried to take money that wasn't yours." Stephen's brow furrowed. "What money?" "The insurance," Daniel snapped before I could answer. "Dad's insurance. $46,000 just sitting there while she hoards it like some dragon on a pile of gold." "It's not hoarding," I said quietly. "It's survival. It's the last piece of your father I have." Stephen's expression hardened as he turned to Daniel. "You tried to touch that," Daniel stepped closer to him, shoulders squared. "Don't act so righteous. You've had your share of help. I deserve something too. I'm the oldest." Stephen shook his head. "Deserve that money isn't an inheritance for you to split. It's Mom's. And you know it." Daniel's voice rose until it filled the room. "She doesn't need it. She's retired, living in this house debt-free. Meanwhile, I'm drowning and she won't lift a finger. What kind of mother chooses money over her son?" The words stung, though I kept my face calm. I said only, "That money is not yours." For a moment, silence stretched thin as glass. Laura twisted her wedding band, her lips pressed tight. Stephen moved to stand slightly in front of me, as if instinctively guarding. Daniel's fists clenched at his sides. His chest heaved. Then, with a muttered curse, he grabbed his coat from the chair and stormed toward the door. Laura followed quickly, pausing only to glance back at me, her eyes full of apology. She didn't dare speak. The door slammed so hard the walls shook. Stephen turned to me, exhaling. "Mom, I'm glad you stood up to him, but this isn't over." I sank into the armchair, my pulse still racing. "No, it isn't." The house was quiet again, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It felt like a battleground, and the lines had been drawn. That night I sat at the kitchen table with the lights low, the only sound the quiet hum of the refrigerator. The day's confrontation still throbbed in my chest, but my hands were steady as I spread out the account statements the bank had given me. Line by line, I checked every transaction, making sure there wasn't a single withdrawal I hadn't approved. When I was done, I printed fresh copies, slid them into a folder, and tucked it deep into the drawer where I kept Robert's old papers. Then I opened my laptop. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before I typed in the bank's website. I changed every password, lengthened every security question, set up text and email alerts for any activity on the account. Each step felt like a lock clicking shut, one more barrier Daniel couldn't cross without me knowing. Still, the sense of exposure wouldn't leave me. The next morning, I called an old acquaintance, Detective Harris. Years ago, he had given a talk at the senior center about scams targeting retirees. I remembered his card tucked inside a cookbook in my kitchen. When his voice came over the line, firm and calm, I felt myself unclench a little. "Mrs. Hayes," he said after I explained everything what you're describing falls under elder financial exploitation, and Massachusetts law takes that very seriously. I exhaled relief mixing with shame. I didn't think it could happen in my own family. "It happens more than you'd imagine," he replied. "Sometimes, especially within families. The law recognizes that vulnerability. If you ever feel pressured, threatened, or see attempts to access your funds, you can file a report. Banks are mandated to flag suspicious activity too. You're not powerless here." The word powerless stuck in my head. It was how I had felt all these years. Giving in to Daniel's demands, excusing his failures, cushioning his blows with my savings. Now hearing there was a name for what he'd done, and a system built to protect me gave me something I hadn't had before: leverage. "What should I do right now?" I asked. "Document everything Harris said. Keep those statements. Write down dates, times, what he says to you. If it escalates, call us. Don't wait until it's too late." After I hung up, I sat still for a long moment. The sunlight cut across the table, landing on Robert's photo by the window. His smile seemed to tell me I wasn't overreacting, that I had a right to defend what he left me. I picked up a pen and began a notebook just for this. The first entry, yesterday's date, the attempted withdrawal, the words Daniel had spat in my living room. Writing it down felt like drawing a line in ink that couldn't be erased. Later, as night crept back and the house quieted, I locked the folder in the fireproof box under my bed. Then I set my phone by the nightstand volume high, knowing that if Daniel tried anything again, I'd know instantly. For the first time in weeks, I lay down and felt a flicker of calm. Not because the storm had passed, but because I finally knew I had tools to fight it. The law was on my side. I wasn't just waiting for the next blow. I was preparing for it. I set the dining table with 3 chairs on one side and one on the other, a deliberate choice. When Daniel and Laura arrived that evening, they hesitated at the doorway, as if they could sense the shift in the air. Stephen was already seated beside me, his arms folded, his presence steady like an anchor. Daniel tried to force a smile as he slid into the chair across from me. "So this is what we're doing now, family tribunals?" Laura eased down next to him, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted the cuff of her sweater. She avoided my eyes. I folded my hands together on the table. "The bank flagged the account Daniel. They've marked any unusual activity. If a single dollar disappears, the police will be notified immediately." His jaw dropped for a moment before he let out a harsh laugh. "Police, Mom? You wouldn't actually drag your own son into court over a misunderstanding." I leaned forward, just slightly. "This isn't a misunderstanding. This is theft. And if you try again, it will be treated that way." Stephen's voice cut in low and certain. "She means it, Daniel. You need to hear her this time." Daniel's face turned crimson. "Oh, of course you'd side with her. The golden child. The one who never makes mistakes. You think I don't see how she favors you?" Stephen didn't flinch. "I'm not favored. I've just never tried to rob her." Laura's lips parted as if she wanted to speak, but she shut them again quickly. Her eyes darted to me wide with something closer to fear than guilt. "You both need to understand," I said, keeping my tone cold but steady. "Your father's insurance is not up for discussion. It is the last thing he left me, and I will guard it with every resource I have. You have 1 month to put your finances in order without touching that money. If you come near it again, I won't hesitate." Daniel slammed his palm against the table, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "You'd ruin my life over this." "You've been ruining your own life," I replied. The words hung there heavy. For the first time, Daniel didn't have a retort ready. His chest rose and fell in quick bursts. His glare fixed on me like he was searching for the woman who used to bend. Stephen placed a hand on my shoulder. "She's drawing the line, Dan. Finally." Laura reached for Daniel's arm, whispering something I couldn't catch. He jerked away, muttering under his breath. The silence that followed was thick, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. I pushed my chair back slowly. "We're done here. You've been told where the boundaries are. Respect them. Or answer to the law." Daniel stood so fast the chair legs screeched against the floor. He grabbed his coat and stalked out. Laura hurrying after him, her face pale as chalk. The door slammed hard enough to rattle the frame. Stephen let out a long breath, then gave me a look of quiet pride. For the first time in years, I hadn't pleaded or explained. I had simply declared the truth and left it standing. The house was still again, but I no longer felt cornered. I felt for once in control. The weeks that followed were strangely quiet, as though a heavy storm had passed but left broken branches scattered everywhere. I didn't hear from Daniel at first, only whispers through Stephen and a few neighbors. His shiny black SUV disappeared from their driveway, replaced by a dented old sedan. A "for rent" sign appeared outside his apartment building. And soon enough I learned he and Laura had moved into a much smaller unit across town. Laura called me once, her voice taut and weary. "He's making arrangements. We'll get it back to you." She didn't say money. She couldn't. But I understood. Then slowly, envelopes began arriving in my mailbox. The first one was thick with cash tucked inside without a note. The second a cashier's check. Each time I logged the date in my notebook, clipped the payment to the record and stored it away. No words passed between us about it. I didn't call to thank him, didn't scold, didn't ask questions. I let the silence speak for itself. Stephen noticed one evening when he came by for dinner. He pointed to the folder on the counter. "He's actually paying it back." "Yes," I said, "piece by piece. And you're just letting it happen." I gave him a small smile. "That's punishment enough." In the third week, I drove past the warehouse district on my way back from the market. There, under the dim glow of sodium lights, I caught a glimpse of Daniel in a reflective vest unloading crates from a truck. His shoulders hunched, his movements slow with exhaustion. He didn't see me. I didn't stop. Later, Laura appeared on my porch, her eyes shadowed by sleepless nights. She pressed another envelope into my hands. "This is the last of it. 46,000 all told. It's back where it belongs." I looked at her, saw the strain in her face, and simply nodded. "I hope this gives you both a chance to start fresh." Tears welled in her eyes, though she swallowed them quickly. I begged him to stop. I told him you'd never let it go. He wouldn't listen. "I know," I said gently. "But now, he's listening to reality." She left before Daniel could appear, her steps quick down the walkway. When I closed the door behind me, I set the last envelope on the table, placed my hand over it, and felt a strange calm settle over me. I had not yelled, not begged, not fought in the way he expected. Yet the money was back, and Daniel, once so proud and reckless, was stripped of the things he thought gave him power. It wasn't triumph I felt, not exactly. It was something quieter, steadier. The knowledge that choices carry weight, and that for once, the weight was his to bear. One Sunday morning, I walked into the small chapel where I had sat with Robert so many times before. The wooden pews still carried the same scent of varnish, the stained glass caught the light in familiar colors, but everything felt different without him by my side. After service, I lingered, waiting until the sanctuary was nearly empty, before approaching Pastor Miller. He looked up from gathering his notes and smiled warmly. "Margaret, it's good to see you. How have you been holding up?" I hesitated, then sank into the front pew. "Not well," I admitted. "I never imagined I'd be betrayed by my own son. I can't seem to let go of the anger. It gnaws at me even when the money is safe again." He sat beside me, his hands folded calmly. It's natural to feel wounded, but anger is a fire that keeps burning the one who holds it. Justice has been served in its own way. Now perhaps it's time to tend to your spirit. Tears stung my eyes as I whispered, "How do I forgive when I still feel so humiliated?" "Forgiveness doesn't excuse what was done," he said gently. "It frees you from carrying the weight of it every day. Your strength is not only in what you protected, but in the peace you choose afterward." I nodded slowly, letting the words sink in. For the first time in weeks, the tightness in my chest eased a little. A few days later, I signed up for a community painting class at the cultural center. The first evening, I walked in with nothing but a blank canvas and a box of brushes Robert had once given me as a joke, saying I should try painting instead of worrying so much. The room was filled with women and men around my age laughing, dipping brushes into bright colors, teasing each other about crooked lines. I was nervous at first, my hand stiff as I painted the outline of a tree. But then a woman named Evelyn leaned over and said, "You have a steady hand. Don't be afraid to let the paint flow." Something inside me softened. By the end of the class, my tree had turned into a burst of color, imperfect, but alive. Week by week, I returned. I found myself laughing at small mistakes, enjoying the chatter about grandchildren recipes books. Slowly, the heavy cloak of betrayal lifted, replaced by a lighter fabric of new connections and simple joys. One afternoon, as I packed up my brushes, I caught my reflection in the studio's glass door. There was a softness in my eyes I hadn't seen since Robert passed. The pain was still there, yes, but so was something else, the beginnings of peace, a reminder that even after deep wounds, life could offer moments of healing if I reached out to take them. It was a gray afternoon when I spotted Laura in the produce aisle of the local supermarket. She was bent over a stack of apples, her hair pulled back hastily, the shadows under her eyes more telling than words could ever be. For a moment I almost didn't recognize her. She looked thinner, worn down, a woman carrying more than her share of burdens. When she lifted her hand to place an apple in the bag, my eyes caught the thin band on her finger. The diamond ring Daniel had once been so proud to buy her was gone, replaced with a plain silver band. It told a story before she even opened her mouth. "Laura," I said softly. She startled, then gave me a faint, tired smile. "Margaret." "Hi." Her voice was flat, drained of energy. We stood in the middle of the aisle, people moving around us with carts and chatter, but it felt as if time slowed. "How are you holding up?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Her shoulders slumped. "It's been rough. Daniel's been working nights, but it's not enough. We had to sell so much move again. Things aren't the same anymore." She hesitated, biting her lip before continuing. "We don't talk like we used to. He's angry all the time. At me, at himself, at everything. Sometimes I wonder if the man I married is even there anymore." I stayed quiet, letting her speak. She lowered her voice until it was almost a whisper. "I know what he did was wrong, and I know he's paying for it. I need to ask you one thing, please, Margaret. Don't go to the police. He couldn't handle prison. It would destroy whatever little is left of him." Her words cut deep, not because I intended to report him. I had already chosen silence, but because they revealed just how fractured their world had become. "I have no desire to see him behind bars," I told her gently. "The law is there if I need it, but Daniel is already living his punishment. You both are." Tears welled in her eyes, and she nodded quickly, as though grateful for even that small mercy. She turned away, then pretending to examine the oranges, trying to gather herself. I watched her for a moment longer, my heart heavy. The consequences had reached far beyond money. The insurance payout Robert left behind had been meant as a cushion for me, but Daniel's greed had turned it into a wedge that split his own life apart. As I walked away with my cart, I couldn't help but think of Robert and what he would have said if he'd seen all this. Justice had found its way not in courtrooms or through police reports, but in the unraveling of a marriage, in the tired eyes of a daughter-in-law who once dreamed of a better life. The echo of karma was not loud, but it was unmistakable. A week after seeing Laura at the supermarket, I found an envelope slipped through the mail slot in my front door. My name was scrawled across the front in Daniel's handwriting, shaky and uneven. For a long moment I stood there, just holding it, the weight of years of love and hurt pressing against my chest. When I finally opened it, the letter was short. He wrote that he was sorry that he had lost himself after Robert's death, that he didn't know how to stop the spiral he was in. He admitted that stealing from me was unforgivable, but he begged for a chance to make things right, to rebuild some piece of the bond we once had. "I want to start over, Mom," he wrote. "I don't want to lose you forever." I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside my journal. I didn't answer him, not yet. For once I felt no urgency to fix what was broken. I had lived my life rushing to patch Daniel's mistakes, carrying burdens that weren't mine. But now at 62, I finally understood that some choices belong to the person who made them, not the mother who always cleaned up afterward. My days had taken on a different rhythm. In the mornings, I walked around the pond at the park near my home, watching the ducks scatter across the water, the trees shift with the seasons. In the afternoons, I painted in the community center, filling canvases with colors I never thought I'd dare to use. There were blues brighter than the summer sky, reds bold enough to swallow a room. Each stroke felt like a reclaiming of myself piece by piece. Friends from class sometimes joined me for coffee after, and we laughed about things that had nothing to do with betrayal or money. I was rediscovering joy in places I had overlooked for years. Evenings were quiet but not lonely. I found comfort in books and music, in the simple peace of knowing I had survived both grief and deceit. The money Robert left remained untouched in the account. Not because I clung to it, but because I no longer saw it as a lifeline or a temptation. It was simply a reminder of the man who had worked hard to provide, of the values he stood for, of the resilience he believed I carried. Sometimes as I sat on my porch watching the sunset fade over Boston's skyline, I thought about Daniel's letter. Forgiveness lingered in the back of my mind, an open question I hadn't resolved. Could I let go of the pain enough to invite him back into my life, or was my peace better preserved at a distance? That answer, I realized, wasn't one I had to rush. Time would shape it. For now, I was content with the life I was building, a life no longer overshadowed by fear, but lit by the quiet strength I had found in myself. And so I ask you, after everything I've shared, if it were you, if your own child betrayed you, stole from you, and then asked for another chance, would you forgive?